what the mind separates, a poem can unseparate. So you can reach a place of non-separation. We first need to learn to take a breath to be in our present state, in our presence. This is another gift of poetry. Whether it's passion, whether it's beauty, whether it's supernal beauty, it gifts a restful understanding. It gifts a great celebration. It's Dionysian, it's Apollonian. Now it becomes the divine feminine, the divine masculine without separation. Now it becomes the mind and the heart without separation. Now it becomes a pilgrimage where any two strangers meet. This is a beautiful occasion. In poetry, this could be that word in which all others abide, that abode. This can mean that poetry can express all forms of the formless, and in various seasons be understood and received in the deepest refuge, in the deepest knowing, not just emotively, not just in a feeling state, but in a knowing state, in communion, in deep communion, so that you understand that you're able to speak your deepest heart, in this case in language, true logos of language, the logos of language. And this is an extraordinary gift. It's heretical to mind, this is heretical to mind, that the utter insignificance of poetry is its very significance. So Plato bans the poet from the Republic, if only for this reason. This may be heretical exegesis. He bans the poet because the poet has closed his eyes for the third eye to open. If only for the imagination, if only to not to be a slave, if only to be liberated, first to be liberated, to speak truth to power, or to speak silence, meaning not to speak the power, but to be the exemplar of the sacrifice, not the surrogate of the source, to find the source. This self-identified state is born of the rational faculty, the cognitive faculty. It demands empiricism. So poetry is not the curricula of scholarship. Though you need the rigor of scholarship, that's not what poetry is. Poetry is the taste of the experience that rests with the work of that scholarship. You need both. So of course you have to read. So you can read thousands of books. I forgot most of those thousands and thousands of books that I've read to birth this consciousness. And that's a beautiful possibility. Literally to forget in order to perfectly remember what you have forgotten. I'm not so concerned with the illiteracy in terms of language. I'm far more concerned with the illiterate consciousness. Because unless we have an awakened consciousness, then the illiteracy of language is something that has very little consequence. Though one mentors the other, though both are inseparable, it's absolutely important to awaken to that consciousness. And poetry can be the impetus, aspirationally, and with pure intention, and spontaneously evoke that very awakening. Poetry has this beautiful possibility of lyricism. Much of that lyricism is being lost. The language itself has texture, it has polyphony, it has intonation, it has subtle nuances. It invites beneath the words the silence that is the greatest gift of what poetry can be, both in terms of revolution and revelation. To know poetry, you need to know poetry not simply by scholarship, not through the rational faculty, not through empiricism, but through the empiricism of the taste of the experience that births the supernal nature that allows the poetry, the divine imagination, the imagination spontaneously, as a lover's touch, allows us to close our eyes and have a divine glance. And so that the greatest conversation you can have with a lover is when that touch is gifted, you say more than you'll ever be able to say in that very silence. This is true of poetry as well. Though it can be shouted from rooftops, poetry allows us to gift another's heart that beatific silence. And it invites us to come. It invites us on a journey that is the essential self, that allows us to lift the veils, the immense distraction in this culture, the immense confliction in this culture. I have never, and I never meet people that if I engage their heart, their deepest heart, I don't hear suffering. For many people, suffering is because it's born of ideation. Ideation is the birth mother of what is ideology. We need first to go to what is essential, what is the essential self. Because if we can't excavate the self to find out what we most truly are, then everything emanates from that foundation. So we need to understand first, foundationally, what it is that we can witness most truly, first in ourselves, to understand another. So in order to honor another, we have to first honor ourselves. To love another, we have to first understand how to love ourselves. To tell the truth, to show up, to pay attention, not to attach ourselves to outcome. This was a Navajo creed, but it could be the Gita. It could be not attaching the seed to the fruit, not attaching yourself to the outcome, to live in a moment that is every other. It isn't that important that you've actually written a great poem. I'm not interested deeply in what is great. I'm interested deeply in what is authentic and how we can redress others in awakeness and in love. For me, the greatest gift I've ever known, and also the most difficult, is how to say thank you to your suffering. Poetry can be an expression of that as well. It's I believe, a truism to say that when we speak most honestly to any human heart, when that heart opens, we'll hear the nature deeply of suffering, and a suffering that's rarely spoken. In a Time of No Song is not an explicit spiritual work, though the underlying continuum that, if you're listening very deeply, and if for some reason you're drawn to poetry, you will hear the spiritus, the breath. It's another practice, a deep practice, the practice of breathing, so that we're not aware, as you're listening, the few people that I can count on my hands. That's the plurality of the singularity. When we're speaking, we're very rarely listening. Though speaking can be listening, and showing is better than telling, though showing can also be telling. It's important to know that the truth of that realization. It's an intimate and liberating understanding. Poetry does not come from mind. Poetry is born simultaneously, exactly at the same moment, when you're out of mind, in no mind, in this, not the Western understanding of emptiness. It's coming from a place of emptiness in no mind, exactly at the same time as you're in mind. Because poetry involves parable, allegory, simile, metaphor, language that is able to speak silence in an alchemical way. Even then you'll receive it in mind. The real wonder and awe of poetry is to receive it in the heart and the divine heart. To know that the answer, without a question, may be a riddle, is a koan. To know what a koan is to know what outrageous mind. What outrageous mind liberates mind. This cannot be known in mind. There has to be practice, as there has to be practice with poetry. And that's the beauty of the journey, because the destination, as plagiarized, as proverbial as this may be, is of course the entirety of the journey. It's not the destination. You can institutionalize poetry. And institutionalizing poetry would be akin to institutionalizing Buddha into Buddhism, Christ into Christianity, and in that, mistaking the surrogate for the source itself. For poetry, it's absolutely important to find the source. So these daily practices, and And when you're deeply devoted to the daily practice, the heart opens like that proverbial lotus in the mud. It opens and it flowers from the dark earth itself. We call it mud. It could be suffering, that births suffering joy. It could be the transformative nature that allows us to find the ecstatic nature, which is the essential self. It gives an immensity of gifts that are already requited before they're ever gifted, because they are constantly abiding inside of us. The poem allows you to articulate silence in a way that is extraordinary. It's extraordinary because it can share the same heart, your heart and my heart. So what the mind separates, a poem can unseparate. So you can reach a place of non-separation. Though there's many seasons, an infinitude of seasons and dharmic selves, different moments in life that we understand radically different, in the different taste, the different fragrance, the different aroma. It allows us a steadfast understanding that this moment is every other moment. It abides in every other moment. That there is the possibility of transformation and a transcendental witness position. Poetry allows you to witness in others, through their deepest expression of their heart, that very experience. So to taste the experience is the depth of the poetry itself, to taste the actual experience through that particular form. What is poetry? What do you mean by poetry? What is your understanding? What have you tasted in your life that brings you to this table, to this moment, which all other moments abide in? In each moment has each word that abides in every other word. So there is only one word in which all others appear, in this consciousness that I'm speaking of, which is what we say when we mean God, non-separation itself. When we're non-separate, we don't ask the question, what is God? We don't ask the question, what is love? If you're asking the question, what is love, it would infer, empirically, that you don't know what love is. To know love is to taste love. In our passion, our Dionysian moment, we celebrate life. Now we have poetry that reflects the taste of that celebration. When that passion transforms into compassion, now that is manifest in language as something quite different. This moment cannot know that moment. So we look deeply and we understand this is not an argument. It's not a debate. It's not even discursive. This is to know deeply what the nature of being is. This is not being or non-being. There's no duality. There's no polarity. It's to not to attach ourselves to thought, to be just an increment above thought, so that we're freed from those attachments. When we're freed from those attachments, we're liberated to speak our shame. This culture desperately needs a place, an understanding, a sanctuary, in order to speak our deepest hearts. There was a time where this was a wandering, mystical feast for me, a movable and immovable feast. Now I live in a deep refuge, something more similar to perhaps a monastic life. But I've written poems from lovers' beds, from hospital beds, from incendiary street corners, and now from a very deep refuge that each of those journeys birthed, like origami, unfolding. And if we speak our shame, if we speak outrage, if we speak truth to power, if we speak and understand our deepest silence, then we can share that very gift with another being. We call that energy love. If it's simply beauty, then we impart the beauty, whatever our vision may be, in whatever moment we're tasting that experience. And then that manifests through language. And another person in the same journey, the same season, will then find the communion with that particular poetry. To deconstruct and to reconstruct in the postmodern understanding, we're losing the texture, we're losing the nuance, we're losing the polyphony. And in doing this, we're losing something of the beauty of poetry. So I can read, I've written other books, and I would read them one night, for example, when I was reading America, people would love it because I was reading with musicians. There was pugilism, there was a closed fist, there was an open palm, because of the passion, because of the, it wasn't vitriol. In some sense, it was a love poem to America, but it was a true love poem to America, as one would speak to their lover. When you speak truly to a lover, you speak your shame. When you speak truly to a friend, you speak truly to their heart. You say things that may not be comfortable. So outrage is critical in poetry. Poetic is also critical in poetry, so we have to learn the form. A stall vendor immolates himself. This gives us inventory. We're reading poems from Syria today, which could have been Rome 2,000 years ago, which can be the biblical liturgical texts. It gives us inventory. The parable says what you cannot say in words. The language allows you to speak things that are unspeakable. This is the if you excavate language, you're left with that silence, but in all the forms of the formless. So I think that is the essential gift of what a poem can be. I've spent more time at this table speaking to people that have deep, deep suffering, which is far more important to me than poetry as a form. I'm interested in the transfiguration of what can happen, even the transmigration of what can happen, in love, in actually love, extending one's love, extending something of the selfless nature of our essential self to another human being, to any being, so that there is redress for suffering, that it's not simply left on the page. It's communion, it's an act of sacrifice, truly sacrificial. This sounds lofty, but there's a time to put the poetry aside, to know that the communion that you're engaged in has nothing to do any longer with the form. There is a place when you need to close all the books and you become the book. So make room, make space for the possibility of true redress and sacrifice, at the same time as understanding that a poem can gift another in language and in the longevity of the work. It's, for me, far more important, or as important certainly, to be able to communicate to another human being, if only through listening, that suffering is a gift. Suffering unveils itself. When suffering unveils itself, you find the gift of suffering. We misinterpret this concept constantly. In the collective consciousness, the zeitgeist of the culture, we run from suffering in order to find pleasure. And what is pleasure? Pleasure is the form of suffering that you're running to. Now you have duality. There's a polarity. At this moment, poetry for me is to find the pilgrimage where there is non-separation. But let it be your life. It should be your life to be a poet. It's without volition. You've been gifted something. You've been gifted an invitation that the mind doesn't need empiricism for. You know that poetry is what you love. You know that song is what you love. You know that you're meant to be a dancer. You've been gifted this rare invitation, and you simply follow the muse of what that invitation is. So when a song spontaneously arises, and every musician knows this, it's not of volition. It's not your own volition. Not everyone is meant to be a poet. Did you write this one? Because poems arise spontaneously as a song when they're most authentic. When the heart hears the music and it needs to speak it. It needs to speak it in order for it to hear itself most deeply. So in a poem, because of the distilled nature of language, in one page, in one word, you can impart an indelible journey. It's a beautiful gift. It's a beautiful gift. So when we prostrate ourselves deeply, the poem is an exalted experience, and it allows us to speak the nature of that very non-separation, to be heard in non-separateness. That's why people can pick up a book of poetry, a lasting book of poetry, and read it over and over, of literature, and each time receive something more enduring. This is an absolute truth. This is not my self-identification. I don't really see myself at this moment as being a poet. I see myself as being a spiritual practitioner and a practitioner of consciousness. And the manifestation of that for me is a poem.
To be a poet is to be a scribe of a beautiful illusion, a skiff of thought song, joy-breaking the clipped wing of the secret language, the rivers of silence beneath that word in which every other appears, the mythic rainbow that is regilded in the least among us, the opus mundi of starlight itself. To say thank you to whatever invitation is gifted, the ordinary occasion of grace, the braille of a lover's touch that gifts a divine glance. The poem writes us, its greatest encomia, most deeply inscribed when refused. And so too I sing that which sings me in a time of no song.
We have a guest. This reminds me of a concert when you're at the end of the concert and someone comes over and tells you have 10 minutes left.
You have half an hour left.
So in this case we have half an hour.
Can I ask you something specific that I'm not here?
That may have sounded like prolix.
You're talking to me.
Yes.